Welcome again to Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Boucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Carl Hulse. He is the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He's covered Washington for 3 decades or so, and he is...
Fortunately.
And he is also the author of a new book. It's called Confirmation Bias: Inside Washington's War Over the Supreme Court, From Scalia's Death to Justice Kavanaugh. That book, incidentally, is on sale in our lobby if you'd like to pick up a copy after today's event. We're going to spend a good portion of our hour today talking with Carl about the book, Confirmation Bias, but we'll also save a few minutes at the end to talk about events in Washington. Not much to talk about there. And then if we have a chance, we'll take a couple of audience questions too. So again, won't you give a warm welcome to Carl Hulse.
Thank you. I'm a native Illinoisan, and I announced yesterday I was a Cubs fan and got booed, so take your shot. Take your shot.
Get the booing out of the way now. That's good. Okay.
And I would, everyone root for the Nats, though. I know that was a heartbreaker, but come on, you got to be National League fans. So that begins tonight.
I'm in agreement on that.
Yeah.
You got to root for the National League.
You should root for your league.
Absolutely.
It would have been easier to root against the Yankees, though.
Well, I'll say. It would have been much easier.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the events that began back on February 12th, 2016, the unexpected death of Justice Scalia, who was on a hunting trip in Texas at the time. And so your book begins with the decision that was made shortly after, hours after Justice Scalia dies. It's a decision made by Mitch McConnell. I think you refer to it in this book as outrageous audacity on the part of the Senate Majority Leader. Tell us about it.
Well, it had a huge impact. I mean, it's one of those single decisions that caused historical change. So on top of being a reporter and a sports fan, I also play in a band on the side called the Native Makers. And we were at band practice that Saturday. So this is President's Day weekend, 2016. Everyone's left town. Not much going on, really. And the Republican primary is still going on. That's very important to recognize. And so I'm at band, and I usually turn off my phone. And so we're finished practicing. I turn on my phone, and I have like 200 texts and emails. And I go, holy cow, what happened? And I look, and Justice Scalia died. And I've covered Supreme Court politics and court politics for years, so I'm a big part of the Times coverage on this. And all hell's breaking loose, and I'm driving home, and it's around 5:30 or 6. There's a funny story, just an aside. I'm from Ottawa, Illinois. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's where the Fox River actually ends. But we had some friends from Ottawa in, and not big Washington people, and it was Valentine's Day. We were going out. And I run into my house, and I say, Antonin Scalia died. I think we can still go to dinner, but it's going to be very busy, a lot going on here, and I'm going to need to be on the phone. And the woman looks at me and she goes, was he a close friend of yours? I'm like, no, that's not it. So normally in these kind of events, there's like a cooling off period. There's about 24 hours where all the politicians and all the reporters sit around and talk about the politics, but it's not overt because there's usually some respect paid to the deceased, and everybody focuses on someone like Scalia, monumental figure, really, was here at the dedication of this law school. And so it was really shocking when at 6 o'clock or so, I get an email from Mitch McConnell's office saying, sorry to have lost Justice Scalia, great American, but by the way, I am not going to let President Obama fill this seat. There's an election going on, and the people have to decide. And we all went, oh my goodness, what a huge thing this is. So from there, events took their course. Now it turned out Mitch McConnell was the first person I interviewed for this book because I needed to get into his head for that day, and I needed his cooperation. So, so about June or so of 2017, I think I first interviewed you, and I said, it's never really, where were you when you made that decision? he was in the Caribbean on a beach vacation.
Which he never does. Right?
Well, it was just like, none of us thought about Mitch McConnell frolicking on the beach. Trust me. You know, it's just a hard thing to imagine. Wait, you were in St. John, I think, and I'm like, really? So he is close to Scalia. He knew him from the Justice Department when he was a junior person in the Justice Department. And Mitch McConnell was obsessed with Supreme Court nominations. He was a very junior staffer during 1969 and 70 when there were two famously failed Nixon nominations. So this is a thing. He wrote a law review article about it back then. So he's in his suite down in the Caribbean. His wife, the secretary, went to the beach. So she actually does go to the beach. So he gets on the phone with his staff, and they're deciding that, you know, Mitch McConnell has no respect for Barack Obama. And he's not going to let him get a third nominee on the court. That's going to shift the court. You're talking about replacing Scalia, you know, the conservative genius, and with someone nominated by Barack Obama who's not going to be like Antonin Scalia. I think we all recognize that. So his staff gets on the phone. He doesn't talk to a single other senator before he makes that decision for the U.S. Senate. Because his staff says, well, there's a Republican primary debate tonight in South Carolina. Trump is sort of the front runner then, but he certainly hasn't secured it. And Ted Cruz is really nipping at him then. Ted Cruz is the alternative, despite the fact that Trump has accused his father of assassinating Kennedy, if you remember that. So one of Mr. McConnell's really smart staffers says, if you're going to block this, you need to announce it right now, because if it becomes Ted Cruz's idea at this debate tonight, no one's going to want to do it because everyone hates Ted Cruz. So they don't want to be seen as following him. So that's what drove that decision. And it was just this set of circumstances. So the ball's rolling. But the other end of this is interesting with Trump. Trump's sister is a federal appeals court judge. Yeah, true. A New York Times tax story ended that. And Cruz had been kind of saying, she had signed on to an abortion ruling that didn't go over well on the right. Although I think Alito actually was in on the same thing when he was on the court. But so Cruz has been running around saying Donald Trump is going to appoint radical abortion extremists like his sister to the court. And this is sinking in. So Don McGahn, who's another main character in the book, and Don is a fascinating person, was Trump's campaign counsel, was his White House counsel, helped Trump get all these judges in, but also undercut him on the Mueller report. So it's this weird dual identity. But so Don McGahn, also in a band, by the way. So that's what you all do in Washington on the side. We all have our own bands. But Don's band is actually very good. And he's a really good guitar player. And he is on his way to play a gig in Ocean City, Maryland. And he gets a text from his wife, who I actually know, and says Scalia died. And Don's pulls over into a Wawa gas station, which is a big East Coast thing, people familiar with Philly, and cries a little bit and gets on the phone with Trump and says to Trump, there's this debate tonight, you have to be really careful about politicizing this. And Trump's like, yeah. And Trump says, what if I throw out some names? And that's where the list begins. Trump realizes that this list of people he says he would appoint to the court that's going to help him with conservatives who are nervous about him. Still, this is February, and you know he's a lot of Republicans worry he's a Democrat in sheep's clothing. You know, he'd contributed to Planned Parenthood. He had been pro-gun control. He'd done some things that made conservatives very nervous, and this was his way of he could demonstrate to them that, hey, I'm going to appoint these people who you know, and some of you are familiar with some of these judges, including Judge Sykes. And so that's where the list came from. So this whole first night is a huge part of this. And Obama is out playing golf in Rancho Mirage. and they're seeing what's going on. And how do we respond to this? Mitch McConnell said, I'm not going to fill it. There's 11 months left in my term. And so they have a debate out there. How do they approach it? They put him on TV and have a statement. And things just kind of unrolled from there in ways that none of us could have foretold.
You know, in the immediate aftermath of this, it was interesting, and you write in the book, Carl, that Republicans were remarkably disciplined in following McConnell's lead. You know, sometimes these things can, you know, people are off doing other things. They
were all scattered too.
Right, and they don't get the message, and they're having their own response. But that was not the case.
Well,
here.
Part of that was the successful strategy of McConnell getting out ahead of this. And, you know, they started to look at this and say, well, if we can block them, let's block them. There were a few exceptions. Susan Collins, who also a major character in the book, obviously, all the way through the Kavanaugh vote, she's just like, well, of course we're going to have a debate and a hearing and, you know, vote. We can vote them up or down. But Republicans stood in there. And, and in the book I talk about, so Congress is gone for 2 weeks here. So the next Wednesday, there's a meeting in the White House of the Democrats and people with Obama, Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough, and then people who've been involved in a lot of these, including Ron Klain, a name many of you have heard, I'm sure, over the years. And so there's a meeting, and you know, Dennis McDonough says, we're going to go through this process the way we normally would. We've appointed 2 Supreme Court nominees. We know how to do this. We're going to go through the interviews. We're going to do this and this and this. And Ron McClain, because Obama wants to play by the book. Yeah. Obama sees himself as someone who's going to play by the book, even though the book is being rewritten really quickly down at the other end of the street. So Ron Klain goes to Dennis McDonough and says, listen, you know you're going to end up nominating Merrick Garland. Obama specifically didn't nominate him earlier for this kind of situation. Republicans have said they like him. The president, this is on a Wednesday after President's Day, the president should go into the Rose Garden tomorrow, and nominate Merrick Garland. Because if you wait a month, the Republicans are going to be able to get behind their message, have figured it out, and you're never going to get it. And that didn't happen. And that's one of the, people say, well, what could the Democrats have done differently? How would they have made this happen? Should he have picked somebody other than Garland? We can talk a lot about that. But, I mean, this is one of the few things that I've heard where I said, you know, maybe that could have made a difference, because then Obama would have been out in front before Congress even came back, and he could kind of change the narrative. But they didn't want to do it. But also underlying this entire thing and through this book is the fact that everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. So even if the Democrats aren't quite getting where they thought they were going to get, they go, well,
we'll get it later.
We'll get it later. So, I mean, but, you know, didn't work out that way.
So Democrats, in some respects, there's this period of time that elapses, and Democrats, in some respect, gave Republicans talking points, past statements by people like Joe Biden, or, you know, actually give the Republicans ammunition for their argument that, no, this is not an idea that no one's ever thought of before.
Right. So I always say about Joe Biden, when you talk as much as Joe Biden does, you've said literally everything. So if you want to find something that Joe Biden said on anything, you can find it. And, you know, I was there, so Congress comes back now. And, of course, everybody's in an uproar. You're blocking a Supreme Court appointment. And Harry Reid, another main character in the book, goes out on the floor and just rips into the McConnell, but then into Chuck Grassley. Obviously, a lot of you guys here know Chuck Grassley, close by, you know, and Reid just attacks him. He's chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He's like, Chuck Grassley, Mitch McConnell can say what he wants. You can have a hearing. You can do all this. And I'm watching this. I'm the only one in the press gallery. Everyone's out in the hallways chasing senators around. I said, I'm going to go watch this for a while. Sometimes, Harry Reid himself once said to me, sometimes you have to watch the floor to see what's going on. And so Reid gives this big speech, but unbeknownst to him, Grassley is snuck in behind him. And Reid turns around and sees Grassley, and he literally jumped because he'd just been attacking him. And Reid continued to attack him the entire time. So Grassley starts giving this speech, and he's like, and then he goes into the speech that Joe Biden had given in '92, warning George H.W. Bush not to try and move somebody during the election. And this speech that Biden gave, it went on forever. In the congressional record, which is really small print, it was page after page after page. When I read it, I go, wow. But so they undercut him the first day. And I said to Chuck Schumer and some other Democrats that day, I go, that was bad for you guys. They go, oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. No, but it became a huge thing. And so Biden over at the White House, they went and talked. He didn't even remember giving the speech. And so it took him days to come up with a good response to that. Schumer and Reid had made similar comments. However, the difference is those were hypothetical cases. Those never happened. Maybe they would have done something, maybe not. It was also much later in the year. I think Biden's speech was in June, obviously much closer to the election than February. But the Republicans dug all that stuff up and used it against him.
So Garland is nominated, but his nomination just sort of languished. Republicans didn't budge. Democrats, as you point out on the books, some Democrats were not excited about his nomination. Right. It just didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, they didn't get any traction. They tried, the first couple times he comes up to the Senate, there's a big buzz of media and people cover it, but, you can't do that every time. And they just made no headway whatsoever, to the point where he wasn't even mentioned at the convention later that year, because we don't want to politicize this. Well, it's politics. But the Democratic strategy at that point was to go after senators in states where they thought they could maybe get them to flip. There was New Hampshire, who she ended up losing. And in Iowa, they thought they were brilliant because they got this woman in Iowa to run against Grassley, former statewide elected agriculture commissioner, and her name was Patty Judge. So they love that. They go, every time we say her name, we're going to remind people that he's blocking this judge. But that didn't happen. They didn't have the money. They went out, and I talk about this in the book. They went out, they were hoping to raise, $30 million to do a big campaign on this. And everybody was looking at Hillary. They're putting money into the Senate races. And, Garland just languishes and it never happens. And one part of the book that people have responded to, Merrick Garland is an extraordinarily fine human being and public servant, no matter what you might say about his judicial philosophy. In fact, I say Merrick Garland is such a good guy, he called me twice to tell me he wouldn't talk to me. That's a special person. That Garland, as they read the book, they said, well, that Garland was treated pretty poorly. And he's still the Chief Justice of the D.C. District Appeals Court. But doesn't happen. And the election comes, and the Republicans think they're going to lose. And they're going to lose the White House. They're going to lose the Senate. Mitch McConnell goes over to the headquarters of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is right over by Union Station, this big Reagan building. And they're there. They think they're going to be having a wake. And as they watch the results during the night, McConnell turns to somebody and says, are we going to make America great again tonight? And they did. And he won. And he took this extraordinary gamble. So Mitch McConnell wasn't just protecting the seat. He was protecting himself. I know it's hard for some people to believe. There's a lot of conservatives who don't trust Mitch McConnell. He's a deal maker. They think he will sell out conservative principles at some point. So Mitch McConnell wanted to show conservatives, hey, I'm willing to go to the mat. We're going to block Obama with 11 months remaining in his term from filling the Supreme Court seat. So it's a gamble, but it was a gamble that had benefits for him anyway. But he won. And, I argue in the book that the consequences of keeping that vacancy there were what elected Donald Trump. The exit polls show very clearly that Republicans who made the Supreme Court their single issue voted for Trump. I think it gave conservatives, evangelicals, a reason to stay with Trump.
Permission
That even though you had the Access Hollywood tape and many other things that you could go into about his character, that they were like, but you know what? There's that vacancy sitting there. He's going to get to fill that in the first month. So I'd rather have him fill it than Hillary Clinton fill it. And I think it elected Trump.
And so he does fill it almost immediately after taking office. Don McGahn, who you said plays a huge role in helping determine the justices under consideration, helping them find federal judges to fill vacancies. They land on Neil Gorsuch quickly, Carl.
Right.
Really fast.
Well, they already had it. They already had it lined up. But here's the other secret that I tell in the book. Not only did Don McGahn have Neil Gorsuch lined up, he had Brett Kavanaugh lined up. They went into this with a very specific agenda. And it was Don McGahn, Steve Bannon. Trump, he's kind of a bit player in his own administration on these things. You know, he's there to announce it and sign the paperwork and everything, but McGahn and these other folks are doing the real work. So that what they're, you know, abortion, gay rights, all these big hot touchstone issues, social, are big with them. But what they really want to do is what they would call tear down the administrative state. They want to use the courts to take away the federal bureaucracy's regulatory enforcement power. And so they're looking for guys who do that, you know. So they find Neil Gorsuch, who's out in Colorado and has written some really powerful opinions on the need to take on federal regulation and how the federal government's grown out of control. Now, some of you in here are old enough to remember his mother, Ann Gorsuch, who was EPA administrator during the Reagan administration and was essentially run out of town on a big scandal. Other people went to prison, she didn't, but she goes back to Colorado. In my book, I talk about how she, in her book, that was confronted by her son, who was in high school at the time, 2 years behind Brett Kavanaugh at the same high school, and says, "Mom, why, you told me not to be a quitter, you know, why are you quitting?" And it was a big moment for Gorsuch. So the first day of the Gorsuch hearing, you know, I wander in to the hearing room. There's a bunch of White House guys in the back, and I go over to them and I say, "Hey, I've got a theory on Gorsuch." And they go, "Well, what's that? What's your theory?" I said, "Neil Gorsuch hates Washington for what it did to his mother, and he's here to get his revenge." And they said, "That's our theory too." So that was what was driving Gorsuch. And so Gorsuch is nominated, and he's totally a judge who you would see nominated by any Republican president. Sterling credentials, education. I mean, it's hard to knock him, but the Democrats, they're in disarray right now. Trump has come in, we got the travel ban. They don't really focus on Gorsuch, and they don't have much ammunition. There's just a couple bad cases for him, including one where he sided with this trucking company who fired a trucker who left his truck because it had broken down and it was like 20 below zero and he was going to die in the truck. And he left, and so the trucking company fired him. So Gorsuch was getting a lot of heat over the case of the frozen trucker. But you know, there wasn't really a lot of stuff that they could hit him on. But here's what the Democrats did, and I think in the book I argue this big miscalculation. You know, there's already been some rules changes to take away supermajority votes for nominees, but not for Supreme Court nominees. So the Democrats had left that, hoping that they could keep it. So they immediately say, we're going to filibuster Gorsuch and require him to get 60 votes. So in the book, I have this big memo that the White House, Don McGahn prepared actually in December about how they're going to get Gorsuch through. And at the bottom of it at that point, before any of this even happens, he says, and when Democrats filibuster us, we'll change the rules. So the filibuster happens and they change the rules. Now, the reason that's important is because Republicans thought that was a huge mistake. Gorsuch is very conservative, but a conventional judge, and you know would have probably been confirmed in most situations. They said the Democrats should have held on to don't force the filibuster vote, save it for the next time. Plus, this is also a conservative for a conservative, you know, and not that important. But Schumer and the Democrats, they needed to show they were fighting back, and so they made that decision. Now, if you just skipping ahead a bit to Kavanaugh, Republicans say, you know, we would have never been able to change the rules in that hearing because of what happened. You can confirm him, but changing the rules to confirm him would have sparked a whole different set of things. So I think, and I argue in the book, that was a big miscalculation around Gorsuch.
Because now it's just a simple majority.
Yeah,
And that's all
on the court, which is the big problem.
Yeah. So Gorsuch is confirmed, and then there's another vacancy, and this is Justice Kennedy decides he's going to retire. In the book, you write that the Trump administration cultivated Kennedy. This was not terribly surprising when you learned the backstory.
Yeah, so Kennedy and Don McGahn again. So all the whole city is watching Kennedy now, and I was on CNN. These announcements usually come the last day of the term. Mm-hmm. So I was on CNN that day with Joan Bikuspic, who's actually a graduate of here too, I think, a great Supreme Court reporter.
Is, yeah.
And I'm not a Supreme Court reporter. I'm a Supreme Court politics reporter, but so she actually covers the court and is much smarter than I am. But we're there and there's no sign that Kennedy's quitting, and I'm thinking, well, I guess that'll be another year. And I'm also, because I'm already writing this book, and I'm also thinking, well, is that good or bad for my book? You know, everything's about
you.
It's about me. Forget America. And then, we go through the day, and but 2 o'clock, Kennedy quits. So and I've done a lot of reporting on that in this book, and there was connections between Trump's businesses and bank and Kennedy's son. And Don McGahn, as it turned out, again, the player here. So Don McGahn had a strategy because Kennedy was the person that they wanted to step aside because he's been problematic for them, even though at the end he was pretty consistent, but on certain things he was a problem. So he's been there 30 years. So McGahn, what he does is he hires a bunch of former Kennedy clerks to work in the administration and gets him comfortable there. Gorsuch is a Kennedy clerk. Look who we're going to appoint. Guys you like. We're trying to get you comfortable with the idea of quitting. So, but the whole way it went down was pretty funny because nobody in town knows any of this is happening. And McGahn gets a call from another former Kennedy clerk and says, well, Justice Kennedy and I had a secret meeting, and he won't say exactly what's going on, but he wants you to be ready to replace me and that I'm going to retire. But he won't tell the White House that specifically. So everyone else in town is wondering, and McGahn and about 10 other people know, but McGahn doesn't tell anyone at the White House. Certainly not the president, because he doesn't want him tweeting it out, right? He didn't even tell the chief of staff. So they sneak Kennedy in the White House so he can tell Trump at this lunch. And McGahn kind of pulled that all off without a hitch. But McGahn, so there's parts in the book, I try to do a lot of foreshadowing. So Don McGahn, before he was campaign counsel for Trump, he was the chairman of the Federal Election Commission put on there by George W. Bush and Mitch McConnell. Where did he go to get sworn in for his new job? Brett Kavanaugh's chambers at the district court. Brett Kavanaugh swore him into his big Washington job, and as they're walking out, the family portrait and everything, and as they're walking out, Don turns to his future wife and says, that guy's going to be on the Supreme Court one day. Don McGahn, when that conversation with Trump, the night of Scalia's death, when he was throwing out names, the first name McGahn threw out was Don McGahn. Brett Kavanaugh. Mm-hmm. Brett Kavanaugh, and said, and then they decided for various reasons not to do it. But so Kavanaugh was in play all along. So now you have this vacancy, and there's a lot of resistance to Kavanaugh on the right. He's seen as a very Washington person, and he's really a Bush person.
Yeah, that bothered Trump, right?
Yeah, he worked in 2 Bush administrations. He was George Bush's cabinet secretary. He handled all the paperwork, George W. Bush. So to Trump, he's like, wasn't that a Bush guy? But they really liked his writings and his theory. McGahn, Leonard Leo, head of the Federalist Society, who was very important in vetting all these judges. So they push McGahn, but there's a lot of conservative blowback. And some guys told me about how they were planning stories, and Trump famously doesn't like the Bushes, and they planted this one story in the Free Beacon, which is a big conservative Washington publication, and the headline is something like, Kavanaugh would be the low-energy Jeb Bush pick, right? Because they're just trying, don't pick this guy, this is who the Bush is like. But, yeah, McGahn talked him into it.
So his confirmation process begins smoothly enough. Things seem to be going well for him. And then we have this...
And plus, you only need a majority.
That's right.
So
That's
the Democrats aren't even in play here. They just need to keep the other Republicans in line.
And as you point out, Kavanaugh has one of these resumes that's very impressive. He's done a lot of different things. He seems like a logical choice. Democrats may not be happy, but really, what can they do? Christine Blasey Ford emerges with her claims. Take us inside what happened after that.
Wow. Well, up to the Friday before the Washington Post finally printed her name, we'd all heard of various things, and I talk about it in the book. From the beginning, there were reasons to wonder about some of this stuff for Kavanaugh, but it was mainly related to his mentor, another judge who had to quit under fire for sexual misconduct, and they thought it was going to be some kind of thing there. I mean, Democrats were really looking for stuff. But even up to the last minute, and in fact, I wrote the Sunday before the story broke, I'd written a couple days earlier, because now the story's out there. There's a letter that she's written, and it seems, but even then the Republicans are saying, unless she comes forward, we're not going to do anything. And so then the Post has been working with her. They break that story. Of course, all hell breaks loose. And we go through just, a repeat of Clarence Thomas 28 years later. I mean, the similarities between the things are wild. And so it's a back and forth situation, not between them, but like one day it looks fine for Kavanaugh, another day it looks bad, more things come out. Who's that crazy lawyer? Michael Avenatti.
Okay,
So the Republicans still point to that as a big turning point when he threw all those other things out there. So
it turned public sentiment.
Yeah, well, they're certainly Republican sentiment. And now they're just, the Republicans actually point to that and say, if it might have just stuck with the one, that they might have got it. But so Kavanaugh's in trouble. He's in trouble. So he makes a decision that he needs to go on Fox News and do the famous interview. And so this is where the Bush side of Kavanaugh came out. So he's consulting with all these Bush people. So they say, well, you need to go on there and be really calm and, not apologetic, but, like you understand this, seem reasonable, that sort of thing. And of course, the Trump people hate that because they want him to be out there punching back and punching back. So there's some worry after that interview that he wasn't strong enough. So Don McGahn again, they bring in some litigators to challenge him in like a moot court setting so he can fight back against the Senate. So the big day comes, they have their testimony. Blasey Ford looks pretty credible to a lot of people. There's the, boy, this looks like could be over. Trump and McConnell are on the phone, and McConnell's like, it's only halftime, right? So Don McGahn and gets in a room. Kavanaugh doesn't watch her testimony. Comes down. He gets in a room back there before he goes out, and Don McGahn's saying, you got to go out there and fight back. You need to reboot the room. You need to really be defiant, and of course, led to one of the greatest SNL skits in all time by Matt Damon, who was a better Kavanaugh than Kavanaugh was. And so so it's about the Republicans, and the Republicans are saying, the Democrats don't matter, right? But he's got to get the Republicans comfortable that there's due process. They win an extra week's investigation, but there really wasn't much investigation. So a lot of this, and you're going to see the same thing in impeachment. I actually wrote a story about this last week, that the Democrats don't matter in these kind of things. You have to keep your party together. You have to present a process that looks at least fair to people, a segment of people that you're trying to appeal to. It certainly didn't look fair to the Democrats at all. But so just to get them to the point. And then, of course, Susan Collins went out and gave that big speech, and Brett Kavanaugh's on the Supreme Court for life.
Let's talk about the aftermath of all of this. And one thing we should point out in the book, Carl does a good job of laying out the history of the, as you call it, the modern judicial warfare, which began with the Robert Bork nomination, but continued in different forms, whether it was the George W. Bush administration and frustrations over federal judges not being confirmed, Barack Obama's administration, same frustration, federal judges weren't confirmed.
Leads to a big rules change.
Right. So there is this history there. But now, given what has occurred in our most recent past, what has that done to the Senate? What has it done to the presidency? What has it done to the Supreme Court?
I argue in the book that this has had terrible ramifications for all three branches, honestly. And it's really torn apart the Senate and ruined a lot of relationships and a lot of the way business is done there. But I also make the point, and Marquette had this big poll out yesterday about the Supreme Court and very interesting findings, that this is just leading to the partisanship that has infected the two other branches is now spreading pretty badly to the courts, and not just the Supreme Court. Actually, at some levels, more importantly, the appellate courts and even the district courts now, because what's happened is that our parties and the polarization in Washington is so intense that one party or the other is doing something, or it's being done through executive authority, and the courts are being called on to referee. And so that makes every court appointment, just that much more important. So everybody is fighting to the death for these things now, and that's why you have this. But the rules are in place where one party now can pretty much install the nominees they want. Used to have 60 votes. You used to be able to say, this person's got to get 60 votes. Maybe you wouldn't officially filibuster, but it was always hanging there as a threat. Like, you can't nominate extreme judges of either side because we're not going to give you 60 votes. Well, those guardrails are off. There's some other internal guardrails. I wrote a whole chapter about something called the blue slip, which, trust me, is like the most inside Washington stories, but it's really interesting. So, you have these fights, and it's just, I think, going to consistently undermine the legitimacy of the courts. And you're seeing in the Democratic presidential campaign lots of discussion about changing the courts to offset this. And people say to me, well, can't we go back to where we were? No one ever does that in Washington. All they do is when you get in, the next time you get your chance, you do the same thing except more, right? So why would you give up, when you get in, say, okay, we're going to go back and I'm going to give up all that power, when you know now, because what we've seen, people can change the rules as long as you have a majority. So I think a lot of bad trends here, a lot of damage done, and damage to personal relationships too in the Senate, which I think are very important, but people are at each other's throats over these nominations, and it doesn't help you get other work done.
And the potential, I guess, is therefore to get worse. Yesterday we discussed the possibility that I guess there could be another vacancy on the court in 2020. I guess that's possible. If that happens, what happens?
So Mitch McConnell, what a way with words. He said that none of the Democratic nominees that are currently on the court would leave without a significant life-ending event. I only know of one.
Significant.
I only know of one. So if there's a vacancy, it's going to be explosive, because McConnell has already said that if there's a vacancy, Senate Republicans will fill it. The difference is, so you ask, what about let the people decide? Well, that was when there was a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. Now we have Republican, so it's okay to move forward. So we'll see how that goes over. Can you imagine? I mean, the Democrats are going to go crazy. There will be, massive protests over that. But maybe, we'll see what happens. The Republicans have 53 seats. There may be a few Republicans who say, you know what, we really can't do that after what we did in 2016. That's just not right. So it's possible that he might not be able to get 50 votes for that, or 51. But I'm not sure. But, Lindsey Graham, who is now the Judiciary Committee chairman, I keep saying to him, I said, well, what are you going to do if this happens? He goes, well, I got to see what Mitch does. I go, Mitch has already said what he's going to do. So he doesn't want to commit. But any sort of vacancy, either Republican or Democrat, is going to cause a big, big blow up. A Democratic-nominated vacancy will really be cataclysmic.
There's also another wild card, at least in the way people feel about the court, and that is that impeachment proceedings. You could have the Chief Justice presiding over a trial.
Well, and here's the other thing about delegitimizing the court. I mean, there's a really good chance that some of this fight over the subpoenas or even how the impeachment trial is conducted is going to reach the court. So then what's going to happen? Are the 5 Republican-nominated justices just going to go with the president, the 2 new ones, right? So how is that going to work? And people are just going to look at that and say, well, that's just party politics. And I'm sure Roberts wants nothing to do with that. John Roberts is super concerned about the image of the court, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, where they managed to kind of hold off some of the more tough decisions this year. They made a few, but they punted quite a bit because they'd already been through this thing with Kavanaugh. People are focused on the court. Maybe we shouldn't be so political. But in doing that, they pushed all these big decisions into this year. There's going to be a big string of really important social policy issues decided by the court. And if you pile on defense of Trump in rulings, the Democratic cry for some changes is going to resonate with their party, that's for sure.
I hope you won't mind. I don't know how much time we're going to have for audience questions at the end. I'm going to be selfish today. I hope you don't mind. Maybe Carl can stick around for a couple minutes afterwards if you have a question or two. But I did want to spend a little time on what's happening in Washington, and we probably should begin with the impeachment proceedings. Give us a sense of how that, based on the people you talked to, Carl, is likely to play out in the coming couple of months.
Yeah, well, I was there for the Clinton impeachment too, so this is, it's hard to believe I could be around for another one. And I mentioned to Trent Lott, who was walking through the Capitol, I said, wow, do you believe we're going to do this twice? And he said, I was here for Nixon. I was on the on the Judiciary Committee. He goes, I can't believe I'm doing it 3 times. I mean, we'd really only done it once before, so which is just illustration of our politics right now, that impeachment are going to be such a weapon. I don't think there's any doubt at this moment that the House will vote to impeach President Trump. It's just a question of how long it's going to take them. Nancy Pelosi fought it off for a long time. She didn't want it politically. People try to predict what's going to, I have no idea what the political ramifications are going to be for impeachment. It can go 1,000 different ways. But the call with Ukraine, the whistleblower, they just found that to be a bridge too far in their minds, and they were going to go for it. Now you're fighting about the process. They're complaining that the Republicans, there needs to be a vote to open an inquiry. There has been in the past. The Democrats would easily pass that, what Pelosi's trying to avoid right now is, but not every Democrat would vote for that, just as not every Republican voted to impeach Clinton. So they know that that vote would spark a Democrats divided on impeachment, even though it might be, 220 to 8 or whatever the number would be. So they may still do it. I don't know. But there is also an old saying in Washington, when you don't have the facts, fight about process. So the Republicans are focused on process now. But impeachment, I've got a couple stories in the works right now about no one really understands certain parts of it, how it all works. They can pretty much do what they want. And the courts have been reluctant to get involved because this is really constitutionally laid out to the House and the Senate. So, but Trump, I think, the Republicans believe they're making some progress questioning the House action. So then it moves to the Senate. McConnell's been pretty clear. I've written at least 2 or 3 pieces about this, that there will be a trial. The question is, how long does the trial go? When do they move to dismiss the charges? How does Roberts preside? Roberts actually, Rehnquist, you remember, went and presided over Clinton's impeachment and put those chevrons on his robe. That was the point where he thought he wanted to dress himself up a little bit as the impeachment judge. But the judge actually has a lot of leeway, and can dismiss things or accept things. So how does that play out? Wild card that I'm also writing about now is there'll probably be some kind of move to offer a censure resolution as opposed to an actual impeachment articles of impeachment. People want to register their unhappiness. Like some Republicans join Democrats. They want to say they're unhappy with Trump, but they don't want to take the vote to throw him out. All the time this is going on, Trump's going to be tweeting like mad about how everyone is terrible over there. And so I think you're going to have an impeachment. You're going to have something in the Senate that would probably right now, of course, end with him remaining in office. There's another odd twist to impeachment. You can convict and remove, but then you have to take a second vote to bar from future office. And that is majority only, weirdly enough. There's a lot of weird things about impeachment. So, it looks right now like there'll be a trial. The Republicans will have a process, as I said with Kavanaugh, where you can kind of go, okay, well, we took it seriously, we listened to it, and, we just didn't think it met the test. And then it gets thrown into the election cycle, and everybody gets to do what they can with it.
Are we essentially done with policy for until the election in 2020?
Actually, I still think the USMCA, the trade deal with Mexico and Canada, can pass. Probably important for Wisconsin, actually. There's a lot of momentum behind that. I think that Nancy Pelosi, there's Democrats, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Rich Neal, wants this. So they need to show they can still do something, that they're just not all impeachment. And this is one thing that has Trump's backing, Senate Republicans backing, and some Democrats in the House. And I think you could kind of do that. I'll tell you what got totally killed by all this was guns, anything to do with guns, because there was a little momentum there after that terrible August. And, Trump is kind of a secret background check gun supporting guy. He's from New York. He thinks some of this resistance to just blanket resistance to guns. And I think there was a little bit of a chance that something could have happened there, but not now. That's done. And I don't know how Trump and Pelosi are going to be in the same room after that last week. I used to say that the Saturday that Clinton was impeached in '98, it was in December. It was after the elections, before Christmas. And if you remember, Clinton was wagging the dog. Remember we were bombing the Middle East. Bob Livingston, who was going to be the speaker, he had to come out and admit to infidelities and resign on the House floor. There's a fight out off the chamber between two members of Congress. Things were really, I just thought it was really shaky. And I said, I hadn't seen anything like that until last week with the fight at the White House and Nancy Pelosi, and then Mulvaney's performance where it goes out and admits to basically what they're trying to impeach the president for, and announces they're going to have a giant international meeting at Trump's luxury resort during the downtime in South Florida, and everybody was reeling from that. And I'm talking everybody, both parties. I was with some Republicans who were kind of less concerned about the Mulvaney thing because they just think Mulvaney doesn't know what he's talking about. They could not get over the Durrell thing, which is why I think you saw them roll that back. They were just hearing from too many people, we can't defend you on that. That is just so blatantly outrageous. You can't get away with that. So last week was not a good sign for other legislation. They still have to do the spending bills. What happens if Trump decides he's going to hold the spending bills hostage over impeachment? That shuts down the government. I mean, there's a lot that could really go off the rails here in the next 8 weeks. So, I do think just the Republicans would like to wrap this up, and I think Nancy Pelosi would too by the end of the year.
So put some historic context on it.
Crazy times.
That's my question, because you've been doing this for 30 plus years. I mean, are these times that crazy?
Yes, they're crazy. I'm sorry. I did an NPR interview here. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. I mean, some people think that organized chaos is a principle that you can succeed in. This is disorganized chaos. right? Nobody seems in control here. And the decision on Syria blindsided everyone, had huge, now this is something with really big consequences, and both Republicans and Democrats say this was a giant mistake, really affects our international relations. And the funny thing here's how big the disconnect is, though, in Washington. So the White House thought two things. The White House thought that it was to their benefit to put out that picture of Nancy Pelosi scolding Trump in that meeting. They thought that was good for them. Now, maybe it's good for them with some people, but a lot of other people wasn't good for them. And two, the letter that he wrote to Erdogan. Call you later. Call you later. Whoa. They thought that was showing strength. And I do think that the thing that got Republicans upset about the Syria thing is that, this is Republicans, not Democrats. They think Trump just got rolled. They did. Right. And that's even they're going, how can we be bowing to Erdogan on this? And that has really alarmed some of them. And I think one thing you're seeing, and one thing that Trump rolled back, the Doral, which I've been to, very nice golf course, is that, hey, we're not going to keep going to the mat for you in the way we have been. We're still going to defend you, but are we going to, man the barricades for all this that's coming if you're going to keep doing this and this? And I think that was enough for some people in the White House to say, let's pull back on Doral.
Let me ask you a personal question as somebody who's been doing this for a long time. And
I'm tired.
And working for the New York Times, because of that, you become part of the media elite.
Enemy of the state.
Enemy of the state, fake news. What's it like being a reporter in these times?
Yeah, it's hard. This is probably the most difficult reporting environment I've been in. But I say this, though, but at the New York Times, I've been at the New York Times in some ways since 1986. So we're always used to more criticism, and we get it from the right and the left too. I mean, maybe some people can't believe that.
Your Clinton coverage, not your Clinton
no,
coverage,
but a lot of
papers.
Yeah, and people are actually mad at us right now because of that, because we played way inside her exoneration from the State Department. I'm glad I don't make a lot of those decisions anymore at the Times. I used to have to make some. But it's hard. I mean, the enemy of the state, it's just outrageous to be called that. I will say I've been called a traitor for when we exposed the warrantless wiretapping program, by senior members of Congress. And, I think we were eventually, showed we did the right thing. People knew that people needed to know about that. But it's funny about Trump's claims against us. This isn't what you hear on Capitol Hill. People in Congress don't say this. Republicans, they're not. They still are like, you guys are an important part of the process here. But it does make it hard. And I think a lot of younger media people are really struggling with this. They've never come under this kind of criticism. I always say two things, and it makes us be right. I said, be right. Make sure I write my stories so that I can defend every word in that story. And I'm particular when I'm editing it, when I'm going over it, I'm like, all right, I can defend every word. You have to be ready to do that. And I tell people that. Don't make mistakes. Any mistake you make feeds that. Be careful of your mistakes. Of course, we make them, but try to avoid them. And just, in cases where we can, post all the material, all the research, all the investigation stuff, where we got this, the documents. Put it online so people can see it themselves. But I will say this, I've always gotten attacked. You rarely get compliments in this business because people just think that's part of it. So, people come up and say, thank you for your service. And I'm like, it's not warfare here. Or for a while, they were sending us cookies and pizzas and stuff, And reporters, if you ever want to get a reporter, just send them food because reporters will eat anything that arrives at the office. Anything, without even checking it. But it's a tough time. And of course, social media really amplifies it and, makes it harder.
Is that hard for reporters? Because I think there is, in the social media world, there is pressure on reporters to constantly tweet, to have a little edge, to get follows.
I think there's a lot of perverse incentives in social media. I mean, I'm on Twitter, @Hulse, if you want to follow.
But it's a pretty restrained Twitter feed.
Yeah, no, I don't.
I looked at it.
Yeah, no, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not out there to get an argument. Here's what's going on. Here's what I'm working on. Here's what I think of something that's important. But there's perverse incentives to be provocative. And, we all know a lot of younger people these days, right? And they have different interests and they want to be prominent on social media. And I do think, clicks, times in our arrogant timesianness, which is a real thing. We're not going to be driven by clicks. We're not going to be driven by clicks. But of course we're being driven by clicks and stories that we work on. And I'll say to some editor, I'll go, we need to be promoting this story on the homepage or whatever. They say, well, it's not getting the clicks. And I'm like, well, it's not getting the click because it's not on the homepage. But so, we can tell how many people read every story, pretty much the kind of person they are, where they live. I mean, there's so much data. And it does drive things. Social media, to me, is the bane of society. But, it is what it is. We need to figure out how to do it. We're just in this huge transitional media time. You guys see it in your own lives and local papers. These papers were really good here. Although I'd read the local paper today, I thought it was actually pretty good. It's just where do you consume your news now? The big fear is this silo effect, right? You see the progressives in here, of the MSNBC, and probably us to some degree, of course, but they get really mad at us. And then the Fox people over here. And there's some new polling out today. I was just reading this morning that the Republicans who regularly watch Fox are much more, they just won't entertain any questioning of Trump. And then there's a segment of other Republicans who say they're not that much on Fox, who say, well, maybe we should have an inquiry. So the media effects of this are really big. And it's very different, of course, from when I came up in the media.
I've got only 2 minutes left, so here's my final question. How do you stay grounded when you, and I mean this seriously, you live in Washington because that's where your work is, and yet you're writing for a national audience. How do you keep connected to people outside the Beltway?
Well, luckily, I'm from the upper Midwest and used to be a pipe fitter and own a pickup truck. And,
You were a pipe fitter?
I was. My family was plumbing contractors. I worked on pipelines and nuclear power plants. My first job on a pipeline, the job was called scummer. So you can imagine what a great job that was.
That's the coveted job, right? You're the scummer.
Yeah. So, I think I have a sense of what's going on. I've got a lot of family around the country. I've had people connected to me radicalized by Trump on both sides, radicalized in both directions, which one person, I'd never heard her say a political word, and she is like the resistance now. And I've known her since she was, 13 years old. So, I keep in touch. I get around a lot, and I try to think about how people around the country are going to do this. And I think it's also, I'm one of the reporters who there's a bunch of books out on this right now, right? There's books being written from the right. There's books being written from the left. I wrote the book from the middle because I can talk to both sides. And I mean, I have a big advantage in that, I'm considered a pretty fair-minded reporter up there. And, both sides are willing to talk to me. And I think that helps me present it. But I'd say the number one thing is, I grew up in a very blue-collar place where people had to go out and really earn their livings and lost their jobs and have lost their jobs and, got hurt really bad during the Great Recession. And, I think about this differently. One of my sisters is a big media thing, devourer, and this was years ago, but it does make you think about things. She was so mad because she was dropping off one of her daughters, and this is the Ottawa paper, I think it was a kindergarten, and they took a picture of the kid crying, right? She goes, how can you invade our lives like that, And it's that kind of thing that makes me think, all right, these are real people, real things. Let's not be too cavalier about it. I also think working at little papers coming up, covering fires in courts and things like that.
That's what matters to people.
Yeah, and it's just like, you're in that job, you're kind of encountering people at the worst moment of their life, right? They're either in court or there's some kind of case, their house just burned down, they just had a big car wreck, their relative died or whatever. So it's like the power of the media is big, even in those situations, so wield it carefully.
We're going to wrap things up there. One reminder before we go today, tomorrow we release the latest Marquette University Law School poll. It will deal in part with our findings on impeachment, but there's much more to it. We still, as Rita mentioned, have a few seats left, so if you'd like to join us again tomorrow, we'd love to have you come back. Let me say again, thanks to everybody who attended today's event. We always appreciate your interest, your attention. My apologies for not leaving time for questions. I'll try to avoid that in the future. But most of all, I want to say a deep thank you to Carl, because he not only spent yesterday with us for the Supreme Court poll release. We appreciated his comments then, and it was a delight talking to him today about his book, Confirmation Bias: Inside Washington's War Over the Supreme Court, From Scalia's Death to Justice Kavanaugh. Again, there are books for sale in the lobby.
Make a great Christmas present.
It would. I highly recommend it. Carl Hulse, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.